Good day.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming, Dr. Finkel. Good to see you again.
Senator.
I've already acknowledged the Minister's cooperation and support in furthering our discussions, and I look forward to the next discussion when we actually get down to the science of it. I await that discussion very much.
I love a budding bromance.
As you know...
With a matchmaker.
As you know, Senate estimates is about accountability and transparency, and that includes cost as well as security and risk. I don't know what... take you back to... and this comment is not meant to embarrass you. I'm just stating a fact, and it's actually admiration for what you said when we met briefly on the 27th. You said you're not an expert on climate science, meaning... and I respect anyone who says that, so thank you very much for saying that. What is the first duty, though, of a scientist?
What is...
The first duty of a scientist?
You know, you can answer that actually many ways. I'm not sure that there is a single first, but it's pursuit of knowledge, truth, the evidence to inform the development of theories, and an open, honest, to use your words, debate about the theories and the evidence that's being presented. Good scientists are very willing to walk away from their theories if there is counterfactual evidence. Science is a complex profession.
Yep. And if a scientist learns of or is told of something that comes to a conclusion, hypothesis, isn't the scientist's first duty to be sceptical?
I think all the scientists I know have a healthy degree of scepticism, but healthy is an important word there. You know, you have to have an open mind, but not so open that your brain leaks out. One needs to think credibly about what's there.
And base it on the empirical evidence.
To the extent that empirical evidence is available, I'm going to be cautious deliberately because you've introduced this as a discussion about climate science, and climate science is a complex science with modelling and mathematical modelling and theory, and for each of the scientists, their particular contribution is being challenged all the time. I don't think there are very simple answers in climate science.
Well, looking at the empirical evidence, that'll decide that. So we'll have that discussion about the empirical evidence.
Okay.
My first responsibility to constituents is to ask questions, and I've got the impression from some of my colleagues on various parties that those questions have not been asked on the science in this parliament very well. So are you aware of my letters late last year and early this year to Gavin Schmidt, who was the head of the NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies?
I'm not.
No, it is public, but I wouldn't expect you to follow everything I do. I certainly don't expect that. I asked him about some adjustments to temperature data. And until recently, NASA and NOAA have spread the notion that there are 4 different independent temperature data sets. Now, what Gavin Schmidt acknowledged is that they rely on the same data that NOAA relies upon. And in fact, we know that there are not 4 independent data sets. There's just one basic data set for the Global Historical Climate Network. So I'd like to know who you seek alternative opinions from, or on whose advice do you make your conclusions about climate science?
Well, on the specific issue of the temperature measurements, the 4 separate records, and I'm only responding to this based on the sort of light knowledge that I have from talking to people, not because I'm pursuing the question, but as it comes up. Fundamentally, a thermometer is a thermometer, an anemometer is an anemometer, and there is a vast array of those around the world. And yes, all the raw data comes from those measurement systems. The 4 different data sets are different in the way they regionalise. So are they averaging a set of measurements to get one point in a large region, or are they taking them all individually and they clustering them differently? And basically my reading or my understanding is it doesn't matter how you skin the cat, doesn't matter how you take those measurements and put them together, you get more or less the same temperature curve.
That's where we would probably have to differ on our opinion there. The other thing is that there have been revelations in the United States about the adjustments of some of the data. And NASA's data shown now over the same period from the 1930s to 1970s as it was shown just 17 years ago is radically different. And whole temperature... Anyway, that's a discussion for us.
Senator, I'll just mention you, because you'd alluded to that in a letter that you wrote to me last year. And again, not putting in a lot of time, but speaking to some colleagues and looking for data to support that, I couldn't find the data to support those errors or adjustments that would be questionable.
I'll be happy to show that later. And there is a marked difference between the satellite data and the ground-based temperature data as well, especially for the last, since the satellite data has been taken. That's not consistent with the ground-based data.
And again, Senator, if you start with a physical means of thermometers on the ground, in the atmosphere above the ground surface to measure temperature, and then you start measuring from orbit, of course there are calibration issues that have to be attended to get them on the same known day, giving you the same reading. But when you do those calibrations, it's a continuous set of measurements.
Well, as I understand it, the NASA's satellite temperature data measuring the troposphere showed no warming from 1998, and arguably some say since 1995, and no unusual trend since the start of satellite temperature data.
And I'm not sure why that would be a problem.
Well, the ground-based temperature data has been massaged to show an increase, but the satellite data shows no increase.
But you were talking about...
Sorry, before you go on, the ground-based data has been massaged. By whom? Now, just wait, Chief Scientist. By whom?
By NASA's Goddard Institute of Space
By
Science.
NASA. And the reason they're doing this is?
Well, perhaps we should ask them.
Well, have you asked them? Given that you're alleging that they've massaged data, that's a very serious allegation against a group of people who helped to propel us to the moon, who are held in very high regard across the world, with whom Australia has a very strong relationship. We cooperate with each other in space communications. It's a very serious relationship for Australia. You're alleging that we're dealing with a group of people who massage data and essentially dishonest and fraudsters. Is that right?
Yes. And I need to be very, very clear that the NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies is a small group within NASA. I'm not talking about the whole of NASA. I'm talking about a small...
So NASA have lost control of the institute.
You asked me a question. NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies has within it a small group responsible for climate. And those people have been shown to have manipulated the data unscientifically. And I'll be happy to go through that discussion with you.
Have you raised this issue with the US administration, with the FBI, with any group within the American administration that could take action against these fraudsters?
I have raised it with people who are close to the Trump administration, and I have sent copies to senators and one other administration person. Yes, I have. And you might notice that NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies has been taken out of climate studies now by the Trump administration and sent back to space where it belongs.
They haven't been sent into space, but they've been sent back to...
No.
I see.
No.
All
so,
right.
Dr. Finkel...
But hang on, because it's one thing to debate the science, but I want to get behind your motives in this regard. Are you alleging there's some global conspiracy of like-minded scientists who are essentially perverting instruments like the UN, the US administration, the Australian government, for what purpose?
Well, Madam Chairman, point of order with respect to the Minister. Estimates are an opportunity for senators to ask ministers and public servants questions, not for ministers to be querying the motives or operations of individual senators.
Well, Senator McDonald, my problem is this. There's a whole series of questioning we can go through, but I want to find out exactly what is behind it.
Well, I'm not sure that this is the place for that, Minister, with respect.
I've set up a dialogue with...
This is for senators to ask you and
Senator Senadinos is a senator.
Not for ministers to question the motives or
I'm not questioning the motives. I want to find out
Thank
what
you
is
very
behind
much.
it.
Thank you for
I'm
the point
happy,
of order.
Chair.
I suggest, Senator Roberts, that you think about how you phrase that.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer.
Senator, can I return to your...
I'm happy to answer Senator Senadinos' question. I'll just answer Senator Senadinos' question. I don't believe there's a global conspiracy. I've never said there has been. In fact, I've deliberately steered clear of using the C word. I'm happy to discuss what I think are some of the things driving this, in our conversations, which is what the Chair is pointing out. So we'll take that up with Dr. Finkel.
Chair, I'm willing
When we have
to,
our discussion with the
try to
scientists.
answer the previous question or pass an observation. May I?
Certainly, Dr. Finkel.
So you were, and I was just trying to understand your concern. You were talking about the fact that surface atmospheric temperatures...
Ground-based measurements.
Ground-based measurements of atmospheric temperatures are rising, but the upper atmosphere temperatures are not.
The troposphere as a whole is not.
Yeah. So my response was, is that a concern, and would you like me to talk about it or address it?
I'm happy to discuss it.
Well, I mean, that is consistent with what the modelling would show. If you have, according to my understanding, as I said, I'm not a climate scientist, but if you've got a greenhouse gas increase in the lower atmosphere, that is actually blocking the re-radiation to space of the infrared heat emitted from the land. And that means that the lower atmosphere is a more effective insulator, and therefore you would expect the upper atmosphere to be cooler. It's very much like, if I can think of an analogy, it's very much like if you had a home
that
was
the upper troposphere should be warmer above the troposphere.
If you had a home that was poorly insulated and you were heating it, say, to a comfortable 25 degrees, and outside it was cold, really cold, minus 15, and your house was poorly insulated with a thin glass window, somebody on the outside in the cold who put their hand on the glass window would feel all the warmth just leaking out of your house. On the other hand, if you had a very well-insulated home, triple glazed, you're balmy, warm, 25 degrees inside, someone's outside in the cold, minus 15, they take off their glove and they put their hand on your triple glazed window, it will feel cold. That person outside, in my analogy, in my mind, is more like the upper atmosphere. It makes sense if the lower atmosphere is providing heat capturing and insulation. But as you said, Senator, we can discuss that further.
I'll just make the observation that you've heard of air-cooled motors. If it moves, it cools, and the atmosphere is a vibrant, dynamic, moving organism, but not an organism, but phenomenon, and it cools the Earth's surface. Yes, I'm just answering that question. So the peer review process, which has been relied upon by a lot of people in lieu of empirical evidence, has been seen to be an echo chamber. And I would like to know who you take advice from, which specific agencies you take advice from again.
Which specific agency do I take advice
CSIRO?
from in respect of what?
Well, you're not an expert on climate science.
So
who do you base your conclusions on?
Sure. I often speak to respected scientists at the CSIRO, and there are many. And I occasionally speak to scientists from the Bureau of Meteorology, and there are many there who are respected experts in their field.
Any other agencies?
No, because I don't spend a lot of time engaging on this.
Yeah. Have you asked for competing opinions, given that we've now been discussing climate as a society and as a species for well over 10 years? Have you asked for competing opinions? Because that issue is still alive. There's a lot of doubt.
I don't go out actively looking for the competing opinions. I am, by nature, an inquisitive, modestly sceptical person. It doesn't matter what the topic is. If I'm interested in it, I ask questions and I browse the internet and look at things. Certainly, from my perspective, and my perspective is not as a climate scientist, but from my perspective, I don't see any credible competing opinions to the core suppositions of climate science.
You don't?
I do not.
Okay,
I'm unfortunate.
thank you.
I haven't come across them.
Thank you. Are you aware of Richard Feynman and his quote, "A beautiful theory is shot down by an ugly fact"?
I am, and I've heard of wonderful things like from Michael Faraday that I hold my most valued theory at the tip of my fingers so that the most gentle breeze can blow it away. So it's core to science that if a contradictory fact appears, you have to question and, if necessary, throw out the theory. But that's not easy to apply as a principle to complex models. Not for climate science, not for human health, not for dietary aspects of our lives. When you're looking at multivariate problems where there are thousands of variables, you can't just look at one fact and say, did that toss the whole thing away? Because that one fact is surrounded by other facts. It's complex.
Why do you assume that I'm looking at just one fact? I'm looking at dozens, thousands of data sets.
You quoted Feynman, and he was talking about one at the time. And in physics, in that kind of core physics, often a single fact will destroy a theory.
So I look forward to continuing the discussion. Are you aware of this statement?
Senator Roberts, I'm just giving you a heads up. You've had well over your allocated time. Do you think we could?
And we have all these sessions.
We have a lot of things to
Senator
discuss
Donald,
today.
we have all these
continue.
sessions outside here.
Yes.
Where we deal
Well,
with
let's
this.
continue that as soon as we can, Senator.
And there's questions that perhaps you could put on notice as well.
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Senator McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Dr. Finkel, you're saying you're not a climate scientist, and clearly neither am I. But I think another senator was asking you about the Paris Agreement and the impact if as is widely reported, the Americans withdraw further from it. Where does that leave the Paris Agreement and the international approach to that?
Senator, are you asking me to speculate? I'm happy to.
Well,
my guess is as good as yours. My reading is that the international community is firmly behind the agreement from COP21 in Paris. And if, as is likely, and I don't know what's happened in the last few hours, it may have actually happened, but if, as is likely...
5 o'clock tomorrow morning, apparently.
Okay. If, as is likely, America, under President Trump, decides not to confirm its commitment to the Paris Accord, that is one country out of nearly 200, one very important country out of nearly 200.
One of the biggest emitters. One of the biggest emitters of carbon.
I said one very, very important country. And so that's a blow to the Accord, but it's not fatal. The other countries have indicated that they are absolutely committed because of the logic, the evidence-based logic of the Accord. And most people who I've spoken, well, actually all people who I've spoken to, and I'm not mixing with the presidents of European countries and other developed countries and of any countries other than ours, as a leader, most of them say, look, it's one president for one term or one president for 2 terms. Things will change.
Well, if carbon emissions are what's causing climate change, and I don't enter into that debate, I have no expertise, but if they are, the fact that America is the biggest emitter, isn't it?
No, I think China is the biggest emitter.
Okay, followed by America.
India.
Could be India by now. It's been very rapidly changing.
Well, I mean, you raised...
They're a very big emitter, yeah.
Well, you raised 3 very... I mean, China, certainly, with all due respect to the Chinese, and I love them, they talk a lot about climate change, but they do very little. They open a new coal-fired power station each week. India, I think, is India a signatory to Paris, or...?
They are, but China in particular, I'm not sure about India, they've got a different set of commitments to what the OECD countries and Australia have made.
But the concern I always have is you've got China, India and the United States, all, my terminology, but all lukewarm towards the cutting of emissions. How does that impact on the changing climate of the world if, as people say, carbon emissions are the cause of the changing climate?
It's a critically important potential impact. If China and India, as the 2 biggest emitters, don't do their fair share towards cutting their emissions, then globally we won't make anything like the progress that is accepted we need to make. China, and same with India, you've got to be careful at what you look at. So it's absolutely true that they've been continuing to open a lot of coal stations, but the rate at which they're opening them is now far below what they were projecting 5 or 10 years ago would be the rate of opening coal stations.
What they were projecting or what they were doing 5 years ago?
Oh, both. I mean, they were really busily opening coal stations, and their absolute rate of opening wind and solar is huge. Okay. But it's not nearly enough to meet their needs because they're a society with growing demand.
But they keep increasing their emissions. Now,
Correct, and they're committed to reducing their emissions, but not until about 2030.
Exactly. Now, in Australia, we emit less than 1.3% of the world's carbon emissions.
About that.
Now, if we were to reduce the world's emissions of carbon by 1.3%, what impact would that make on the changing climate of the world?
So I'll give you two answers to that. And one will be a little facetious, I apologise in advance. The more serious one is that we are a well-respected country and we have to show leadership alongside the other countries in the OECD, the other developed countries. And so if we walk away, resign from our commitment, it's a bad signal that could be like America walking away from its commitment.
But that's not my question.
Part of a carry on. In terms of the need for us to worry about our tiny contribution, to me, and this is where I apologise, it's a little bit like voting. Does your vote count in an election? Does my vote count in an election? No, it doesn't. But if everybody took the attitude that their vote doesn't count and no one voted, we wouldn't have a democracy.
But Doctor, you're entering into an argument which I'm not having. I mean, I didn't put those propositions to you. I simply asked a question. If we reduce the world's carbon emissions by 1.3%, what impact would that have on the changing climate of the world?
Virtually nothing.
Okay. If Australia then reduces its emissions, its 1.3%, by 50%, what impact would that have on the world? You've just answered on that, nothing. What impact does it have on Australia's economy, our manufacturing and other activities, vis-a-vis our biggest trading competitors, i.e. United States, India and China? I mean, what's it do to our economy? And I'm assuming your science, I know your science is not just pure science, but the economy is part of the scientific mix. So what impact does that then have on Australia's competitiveness against the United States, India and China?
Senator, very important question, and the answer depends on how we get there. If we get there, as there is some risk, through policy uncertainty that leads to, as I was discussing with Senator Carr earlier, lack of investor confidence and generation capability and new low-cost generation capabilities coming into the market, we'll have problems because we'll achieve the reduction for all the wrong reasons. Demand destruction will achieve the reduction because the industries that are using the energy won't be able to afford the energy. But if we can do it through a deliberate, policy-driven process, then we can take advantage of the constantly reducing prices in new energy generation. We can integrate them into the system and we can take advantage of the continued low-cost generation of our existing generation as we make that transition. So my answer to your question is it depends on whether we do it in a atmosphere of policy uncertainty or with some conscious decision to follow a trajectory into the future, taking advantage of the innovations, the low-cost generation technologies that are increasingly becoming available.
But I come from the Townsville area of North Queensland, as you may be aware, an area that is experiencing unprecedented, critically high unemployment on the basis, to a degree, of hugely inflated electricity prices. The two biggest employers in the region, the copper refinery and the Korea Sons Metal zinc refinery, both big consumers of electricity, both of whom set up and created jobs in Townsville because we had one advantage over everywhere else in the world. We had cheap coal-fired power. We no longer have that, and we face the prospect of those employment sources in Townsville failing. Now, I hear your comments about cheaper renewables, and one day there may well be. But what I'm trying to get from you or people who can help me in this is the immediate to medium-term impact on our lifestyle, our nations, compared with China, India and United States.
I understand where you're going. You're positing a best-case scenario where if we were to drop out of whatever it's called, Paris and all the rest of it, no obligations, we go back to nirvana, which was a low-energy past. That's not what we're going to have in the future. Part of the reason we've got high energy prices today is continuing uncertainty about the direction of policy. You can argue the toss about the elements of that. The outcome of Paris, if the US is moving out of Paris, the problem is around the world there will therefore be uncertainty about the path of energy policy in a global sense. And what uncertainty does is it increases the risk premium on all sorts of investment, whether it's conventional investment like coal-fired power stations, or on alternative energy. People will be uncertain. And the people who look at this are bankers who are looking to finance power plants, insurance people who look at what are the implications of ongoing climate change, because they're looking at things like what will happen down the track to sea level rise if we don't meet the 2 degrees limit and everything else. Senator McDonald, there are people out there who have to bank their money 10, 20, 30 years down the track on what the world is going to look like. And if they think the world is uncertain about where things are going, they're going to be confused about where to invest. That increases the risks to the global economy from this uncertainty. And that is something that maybe it doesn't factor in your mind at the moment, but when we have these sorts of agreements, part of the reason we have these global agreements, get everybody in, equitable sharing of the burden of dealing with these problems, and importantly, giving some certainty to investors going forward. Now, that's very important. The other point I'd make is we make a lot of agreements, and we make them as a small country because it's in our interest. We make a lot of trade agreements, and we want other countries to keep those agreements because it's in our interest. It's in our interest to get stability around climate issues and to minimise the cost of adjusting to the world as it may be in 40 or 50 years' time. And we have to be seen meeting our agreements. The other thing that could happen is other countries may decide to take sanctions against us on environmental grounds because they'll say, we don't particularly think this country should be able to get off scot-free when we are making an effort to deal with a global challenge. So as a government, we have to think about all of that. At the moment, where we stand is, because we don't know quite where Trump will go, we think the money is on him withdrawing, is we believe we should stand by our agreements. We've got other policies in place. I'm happy to take you through them personally in terms of where we're going with the Finkel review, where we want to end up. But we can't end up in a situation where we look as if we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to this energy adaptation.
Well, thank you.
The US is doing this to protect jobs, to give certainty to its industry.
Senator Roberts, I think that maybe we're just getting into a debate across the table.
Well, I don't want to get into debate, and I'll take the minister's talk as a response to the question I asked. Except, Minister, you say if we include everybody, but I've just demonstrated to you that the 3 biggest emitters are not included.
I can tell you now, the Chinese are putting a lot of bets on the table on when it comes to energy policy. And if for no other reason that they also face very heavy pollution, and they know on the ground in China that they've got to take strong measures for this
has never been classified as a pollutant.
I
accept that's your view and the
Last
government's
question,
view.
Senator McDonald.
Your view and the government's view. But I'm sorry, the facts are otherwise. The Chinese might be talking about that, but the facts are different.
Well,
the Indians
we
might be talking about
offline,
it, but the facts are different. And I'm just concerned about the Australian way of life, our privileged
a whole suite of things we're doing for that reason.
Could I just
Yes, Senator McDonald, I think Dr Finkel would like to make some closing remarks.
And I won't ask anymore. But
Senator McDonald, it's not obvious to any of us who've been looking at this there's a simple way to go back to the really cheap electricity of the past. I'm not recommending here individually that anybody should be trying to shut down the coal in Gladstone, the coal-fired electricity. But it's got a limited lifetime. It's got a limited lifetime. It's sometimes going to have to be replaced. Now, on today's cost of building new coal in Australia, it's a lot more expensive. Not a bit, but it's starting to get a lot more expensive than doing that with alternative energy. I'm not trying to make the decision. I'm just pointing out that there is no cheap way forward.
Well,
there's
will make
lowest cost, but not cheap.
But investors will make their decision. I'm not going to put money into a coal-fired power station, but I understand there are a lot of moneyed people around the world who'd be very keen to establish a coal-fired power station in North Queensland.
And Dr. Finkel,
I don't think we're getting anywhere.
The cost of producing power in other countries that are using our coal is cheaper than here because of the taxes and the burdens and the imposts.
I'm not trying to analyse, Senator, why it is, but the actual cost of bringing on new coal in this country per megawatt hour is projected to be substantially more expensive than the cost of bringing on wind or solar. I don't care who makes the investment choice. Good luck to them.
I'm absolutely certain, Dr. Finkel, when your review comes out, that all will be revealed. And in the meantime, there isn't much point continuing a debate across the table. We are very, very short of time. I think there being no further questions that I want to get into, we should let you go. Thank you very much to the Office of the Chief Scientist for being here today. Thanks. And we are only an hour and 3/4 behind. So I now call upon the Department of Industry and Science's the officers from Outcome 1, enabling growth and productivity for globally competitive industries through supporting science and commercialisation, growing business investment and improving business capability and streamlining regulation. Goodness me, that's a mouthful. Not this one.
Can I just check, Chair, that you'll be addressing cross-portfolio issues first, as under that sub-program 3.1 and 3.2?
Portfolio issues / program 3.
Thank you.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
That'll come.
Yes. That's a bit. Yes, sub-programs 3.1 and 3.2.
The National Measurement Institute?
You can raise that under either program 2 or cross-portfolio.
Cross-portfolio, if I could.
Secretary, are we expecting anybody at the desk? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Hey, in trouble now, Virginia's here.
Good afternoon, Dr. Fisk and Ms. Weston. Thank you, of course. Welcome to the Economics Committee. Do you have an opening statement? I don't believe that you would have an opening statement from this.
No, we're from industry.
I was about to say. We might kick off the questions then with Senator Carr.